time of the recording of this video, first day of June 2022, I'm finally making some real progress in the Lessons in Logic playlist. I have dreams of doing perhaps nice videos on Confucianism, or at least on the Analects, and perhaps a nice video on, actually a nice series on A Pluralistic Universe by William James, because I feel like it. And maybe some other cool stuff. I think on Rumble only I might do a nice long series on Augustine's theology of desire. But this video really needs to be made. Someone out there needs to see this material. Actually, the details of this material don't even matter. The format of this material is what matters. I know my students need this information. And of course, if my brain holds up, this will have to go on a playlist, multiple playlists for my own courses. This is a chart of some virtues as explained by Aristotle. What's interesting is that the internet is filled with charts that have just these three columns. And most of them will probably not have the subtlety I've tried to include here in this middle column. But in addition to this particular subtlety, what we really need, and what I want to emphasize here, is this column. Let me first, before I begin, state that this is a chart of some virtues in Aristotle's Ethics. We're looking at books 2 and 3, I believe, of the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. And there may be a number of mistakes, probably mostly small ones, but there may be any number of mistakes in this chart. And what I mean by that is, if I'm talking about what one of the virtues is concerned with, and I try to make a distinction between these two virtues, by saying they're concerned with what honor you think you deserve and what honor you try to get, and that's the distinction between them. There's a huge chance I've made some mistake of imprecision or some other mistake in how exactly I'm describing this, and who knows, maybe some of the words here are not the best. Like here's an obvious one. I say temperance. Why don't I say moderation? I should say both. These are both words commonly used to describe this particular Aristotelian virtue. The virtue of temperance and the virtue of moderation are really the same thing. And I should have both terms in here. All right. The real reason I'm doing this video is not to mention, here are some Aristotelian virtues: courage, temperance or moderation, liberality, magnificence, pride or great souledness, greatness of soul, good temper, friendliness, truthfulness, blah, blah, etc. The real reason to make this chart is not to illustrate that the virtues are means between extremes in Aristotle. The real point of this is not even to emphasize what I've already explained in some detail, as I recall in some other video on this channel, that the virtue is the mean, the virtue is the balance. The virtue is not that which is balanced. I've seen students say, I don't know how many times, something like, Aristotle says you shouldn't have too much courage. No, that's not what Aristotle says. Aristotle says, don't face fearful things too much. Courage is the virtue of not facing fearful things too much. And the virtue is the balance. Not too much facing fearful things, not too little. Courage is the virtue of not facing fearful things too much or too little. Courage is the balance. The virtue is the balance. It doesn't make any sense to balance a balance. You can balance a thing like facing fearful things, and you cannot balance a balance. Aristotle does not say don't have too much courage or too little courage. He says courage is not having too much of a particular thing. Don't balance the balance. Don't balance the balance. Don't think that when Aristotle says don't be rash, he's saying don't have too much courage, or when he says don't be insensible, that he's saying don't have too much moderation. Now he's saying have moderation. To have moderation is to not have too little of another thing. To have courage is to not have too much or too little of another thing. It's to emphasize that other thing that I am making a video about this chart. That really needs to be emphasized. Now, virtue is a mean between extremes, at least these virtues are, and the virtue of temperance means not having too much pursuit of physical pleasures, not having too little, but the virtue is a little closer to the not having too little side, and the virtue of courage is a little closer to the too much side of facing fearful things. Courage is a balance between the extremes of cowardice and rashness. Rashness means facing fearful things too much. Cowardice means facing them too little. Courage is closer to rashness than it is to cowardice. Moderation is closer to the vice of having too little in pursuit of physical pleasure than it is to the vice of having too much. So one somewhat important reason to have this chart is to try to illustrate this. I think I may have it right. Which of the virtues are closer to the too much side of the chart, and which of the virtues are closer to the too little side? Courage is too closer to the too much side. Temperance is too close to the too little side. Pride or greatness of soul is closer to the too much side. Good temper is closer to the too little side. The real reason to make this chart is just to emphasize there is another thing. There are more than 3 columns. If you want to understand Aristotle's virtue, you cannot just look at the virtue and the vices that the virtue is between and think of these 3 things. You must always think of a 4th thing when you're talking about Aristotle's virtue. Aristotle's account of the virtues. The virtues are concerned with something. The virtues are balancing a thing. That 4th thing must be understood. You cannot understand the healthy balance just by understanding that it's between too little and too much. You have to understand what it is that it's balancing. This is the mistake I've noticed my students making lately when they make mistakes with Aristotelian virtue. I want less of this mistake. So at this point, it might be prudent to just end the video. You can read this for yourself in all likelihood. However, I think maybe I'll go over some of the details in case there's something wrong with the software on your phone or something. And for the visually impaired, worse than I am. I'm okay when I wear these glasses, but it occurred to me recently, I'm not doing much for people who are just listening to this. There may be visual impaired folks who have more difficulty reading this than I think. Okay, so for the rest of this video, I'm just going to read what's on the chart, and I hope that's helpful for someone who may need it read. But the rest of you, if you don't need me to read the chart, just freeze frame, read as much as you need to for those first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 virtues. Freeze frame, read as much as you need to for the next 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 virtues. And now, for anyone who has difficulty reading on your screen, we have 4 columns on this chart. First column, what is the virtue concerned with? What is it that the virtue balances? Second column, the character trait of having too little, or the state of having too little of that thing. Third column, what is the healthy balance? What is the virtue? And then 4th column, what is too much? And there's a left and a right in that healthy balance column, because a virtue could be too close to the too much side, or it could be too close to the too little side. The virtue could be closer to the too much side or closer to the too little side. And then we have rows for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 virtues. I'm not entirely sure I even got all the virtues you can get by reading this passage. Again, this is conceptual. I'm not trying to give you a thorough list of what are all the virtues and vices and what are the virtues concerned with. I'm quite happy if someone says in a comment, hey, you made a mistake. You didn't quite accurately describe what the virtue of pride, greatness of soul is concerned with. Or you should have used a different translation for such and such a Greek word, for example, the vice of vulgarity or something. That's fine. There may be any number of minor mistakes here. I'm delighted if we can make some improvement in some people's understanding of the fact that a virtue is concerned with a thing, and that it's a healthy balance of a thing. So you have to know what that thing is, and what the virtue is, and what would be the state of having too little of that thing, what would be the state of having too much of that thing. The states between which the virtue is, and hopefully know also whether the virtue is closer to the too much side or to the too little side. Our first row then is the virtue concerned with facing fearful things. When you do that too little, you're a coward. Your character state is cowardice. When you do it too much, your character state is rashness. When you do it the right way, the healthy balance of facing fearful things, the virtue you have is courage, and it's a little closer to the too much side than to the too little side. When you pursue physical pleasures, that's our next row. When you pursue physical pleasures properly, your virtue is called moderation or temperance. The virtue of moderation or temperance is concerned with pursuing physical pleasures in a right way with a healthy balance. Pursuing physical pleasures too much is called indulgence or self-indulgence. Pursuing them too little is called insensibility. The virtue of moderation is a little closer to the insensibility side than it is to the self-indulgence side. We have two virtues concerned with money. I think we could approximate these, though I'd have to go back to the text, and I may well be getting this somewhat imprecisely down for you. I think we could approximately distinguish them as these are the differences. These two virtues, the difference between these two virtues is the difference between spending money and donating money. Where when it comes to spending money, the virtue of doing it right is called what Aristotle calls liberality, which is somewhat closer to spending too much money than spending too little. Now I'm wondering, did I get that right? My own inclination in describing a virtue like that would definitely be to put liberality on the too little side. Anyway, with the virtue of spending money properly, the virtue is called liberality. Spending money too much is what we could call prodigality, and spending money too little is what we can call meanness. The virtue concerned with donating money, spending money on public projects or these sorts of things. Keep in mind that Aristotle is describing the virtues for the upper class Athenian male here. He's not necessarily describing in all cases the virtue he recommends for all human beings at all times. A better list of Aristotelian virtues that is for all of us might be in order. Ask me to talk about that sometime if you want me to. This would be then the virtue concerned with, more or less, if I'm understanding the general idea correctly, donating money. Not doing that enough is called stinginess or paltriness. Doing that too much is called vulgarity. Doing that with a healthy balance is called magnificence or munificence. And that's the virtue that's closer to the vulgarity side, it's closer to the too much side. Actually, we'd probably want to, if we were going to give a more accurate account of virtues that apply to everyone, make this a virtue very similar to what Aristotle's talking about. But it would be, I think, the virtue of charitable donations, which applies to everyone. Everyone can be stingy or paltry or spend too much money and perhaps make yourself bankrupt by giving too much money to charitable causes or giving it mindlessly without paying any attention to where the money's going. But I wouldn't want to use a word like magnificence or munificence or vulgarity. I want to use a word like, I don't know, I want to use a religious word like almsgiving or proper almsgiving or something. But that's, that's an Aristotelian mode of thinking through the virtues that are relevant to all of us and drawing from traditions outside of Aristotle, draw from religious traditions, and probably Kant too. And Mill, John Stuart Mill. Anyway, I'm off topic here. That's the sort of thing I could talk about had I whirled enough in time if I were trying to give my own account of the virtues in an Aristotelian style, but not necessarily assuming that Aristotle is right on his virtues. And in this chart, we're trying to give a rough understanding of what is Aristotle's account of the virtues, what is Aristotle's list of the virtues, and which vices they correspond to, but above all, what is it that the virtues are balancing? Next, thinking I deserve honor is something that needs to be balanced. And what Aristotle calls pride or greatness of soul. Off the top of my head, I want to say the Greek word there is something like megalopsychia. I've never been clear on transliterating a Greek upsilon as an English U or an English Y, whatever. Megalopsychia, greatness of soul is the virtue, and it's closer to the vice of having too much, but it's still in between the vice of having too much, which is vanity or braggadocio, and the vice of having too little of thinking you deserve honor, which is humility or littleness of soul. Littleness of soul might be a better terminology, a better translation than humility. Had we whirled enough in time, we'd want to carefully examine the text, look at some alternate translations, get a feel for what the Greek verb is, look at the text in context, and ask ourselves, is Aristotle making the mistake, which you and I probably agree is a mistake, of saying humility is a vice? Or is he talking about something else that is mistranslated as humility? We're not interested in that oversimplification. We're interested in getting the big picture here right. Understand Aristotle according to the right way of thinking. You cannot balance a balance the virtues must be understood not only as in between the vice of having too much and the vice of having too little, and not only as usually a little closer to one of those vices than to the other, but also as in context of a fourth thing, hence a column with a chart with 4 columns, because the virtues are all balancing something. The virtues themselves are not balanced. The virtues are the balancing of those things. And the virtue, our next virtue, balance, is trying to get honors, or aiming high is my tentative description. Trying too hard, aiming too high, trying to get more honor than you deserve is ambition. At least that's how some translations will render it. Too little is unambitiousness. The healthy balance doesn't actually have a name. These days, you might want to say proper ambition. I think that's probably a very good terminology. So aiming high is something you can have too little or too much of. Unambitiousness is a vice, and almost the opposite to that, but not quite, would be proper ambition, the right balance. But it's still possible to have a little too much of that, aiming high, which we could call improper ambition. And then we have the vice of Angerlessness, because never being angry is not actually a virtue. Now, it might be, according to the Stoics. I dare say there are some Buddhists who give that account, and probably Yoda. But Aristotle, going along with most Christian philosophers, for example, will say that anger is not always bad, but anger is something that has to be balanced. It's easy to be angry. This might be a quote from an Odyssey movie or a quote from Aristotle, or more likely both. I think I checked once and it was both. To be angry is easy, but it's not a quote. This is a paraphrase. It's easy to be angry, but it's hard to be angry at the right time, in the right way, for the right reason, and at the right person. Anger must be balanced. Having too much anger, we can call irascibility, or passionateness, or using contemporary English terms, rage is a darn good term for that sort of thing. Angerlessness, however, is also a vice. But the virtue of good temper, sometimes translated meekness, is closer to angerlessness, but a good-tempered person is still able to get angry when the situation calls for it. Then there's what is pleasant in daily life. That's from one of the public domain translations. What is pleasant in daily life is a thing that needs to be balanced. You can have too much of this quality that is pleasant in daily life. Having the right balance is friendliness. It's closer to the too much side than to the too little side. But there is such thing as having too much of what is pleasant in daily life, which would be obsequiousness or flattery. And that tells you what we're talking about here. What is pleasant in daily life means, well, being nice to people, saying nice things to people. You can overdo that, and we call that flattery or obsequiousness. But you can do that too little, and it's better to aim for doing it too much rather than aim for doing it too little until you've learned to achieve that mean of friendliness. Churlishness or quarrelsomeness is what we could call doing it too little. And then finally, there is, well, almost finally, we're near the end, telling the truth about my own virtue or my own worth, about how awesome I am, I think is more or less something that needs to be balanced by one of our virtues. And thinking too little of yourself or telling too little of yourself would be mock modesty. Telling too much would be boastfulness. And what Aristotle refers to as a healthy balance here is truthfulness. If you're going to give an English equivalent explanation, maybe you should say not truthfulness, but self-respect. Self-respect actually might be a good approximation. I'm not sure of that, but I'm going with that for now. Truthfulness or self-respect is the virtue of telling the truth about your own merit. And it's closer to the boastfulness side, but it is possible to overdo that sort of thing. Then last virtue, giving amusement. Now, I think what Aristotle's talking about here is being entertaining. For example, being able to tell jokes at parties. This is something you can have too much of or too little of. Too little of it we can call clownishness or boorishness. Too much of it, though, is buffoonery. And there is a virtue of the healthy balance of being able to the healthy balance of doing things that are entertaining, like telling jokes at parties. Aristotle will describe that as ready wit or easy pleasantness. This is the character trait of a person who's not seeking too much attention at parties, telling jokes too much, the person who knows when it's time to shut up and not overdo it, not be too much of a good thing, not try to be the center of attention too much. Don't make an idiot of yourself, hogging all the conversation, telling too many of the jokes at the party. And I think in Aristotle, the virtue of getting this right is probably a little closer to the deficiency side. It's a little, the virtue of doing this the right amount is a little closer to the vice of doing it too little than it is the vice of doing it too much. Okay, we're done. Thanks for watching. I hope this helped. I hope this helped someone out there understand the Aristotelian concepts. By all means, in comments or in your own studies or wherever the heck you like, get a better understanding of the details here. I think the odds are very good that I made one or more mistakes in how I'm describing these virtues, or if I place a virtue closer to one side or closer to the other side. But the general idea here that I'm trying to emphasize, the virtues are concerned with a thing, and so you need 4 categories for each virtue. That general idea, yeah, I'm pretty darn sure I got that right, and that's terribly important. The virtues are concerned with things. They are balancing things. A virtue balances a thing. You can have too much of that thing or too little of that thing. The virtue is the healthy balance of that thing. Remember what that thing is, and don't think that that thing is the virtue. You can't balance a balance. Courage is not a balance of courage. Courage is a balance of facing fearful things, etc.